All right, listen, New Orleans Saints front office, come here. I know you love to trade up, but this year, don't do it. Don't do it.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow for free wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well, so you don't miss the latest daily episode. Of course, I am your host, Ross Jaxon, at Ross Jaxon Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today, Saints Wire, Tuesdays over on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, it is Mock Draft Monday, so we'll get to one of our fan mocks this week from Big Rob, who goes for a tight end in the first round. I'm going to explain both my reservations and why I should probably also shut up. I'll get to both of those things. But first, we're also going to take a look at whether or not the Saints could trade up or trade down in this year's draft. Now, the Saints haven't traded down since 2007, so in a little while, I'll tell you why that could potentially change this year. But first, let's talk about why the New Orleans Saints shouldn't even bother trying to trade up in this year's draft. Asterisk, all right? I'm going to put a little asterisk there because I'll tell you, there's one player that I would trade up for, maybe two, and they're both wide receivers. So if you want one of those impact rookie wide receivers that you can kind of safeguard that position group with, especially because you're a little bit maybe just wanting to safeguard yourself in case there's any more injuries to Michael Thomas or anything like that, or even injuries to Chris Olave, and you kind of want to have that backup plan that can be your backup plan this year and then your future after that, completely get it. Jaxon, Smith-Njigba's up there. Quentin Johnston could be up there. So I get that. Like if you're trading up for somebody that's going to have an immediate impact for you, or maybe a quarterback starts to tumble and you're another team, then that makes sense. But for the Saints, you just went out there, you got Derek Carr. So I don't even think that like the quarterback makes sense for a trade up. So here's why I say avoid the trade up in this year's draft. This is one of those drafts that's, let's just be honest, not that impressive. Like there's some really good top talent in this draft, but there's maybe 12 first round players, like maybe 12 first round grades. And that's not entirely out of the ordinary, right? If you're picking towards the back half of the first round, you're very rarely picking guys that the NFL teams, clubs, scouts are giving first round grades, right? Which is different than first round prospects or first round value, because somebody might have the upside of a first round grade, CJ Gardner-Johnson, but have reasons that they fall to the fourth round, have reasons that they fall to the second round or towards the back half of the first round. So usually if you're picking 16, 17, 20 or higher, right, later, you're probably getting a second round grade player because all the first round graded players are off the board. And your first round graded players are going to be heavily quarterbacks, guys like Bryce Young, guys, of course, like CJ Stroud, who's my QB1 this year. Anthony Richardson could be up there. Guys like Will Anderson, Jalen Carter might still be there. So there's a bunch of those like first round kind of blue chip-y type guys, right? The guys that are the best of the class. But this year, there's a whole lot between round 2 and round 5. You might even go to round 6 that can come in and be really good value for you immediately, first couple of years, right? And so for the Saints, trading up from 29, if you want to get somewhere where you can get a first round prospect, i.e. into the top 15, you're going to end up giving up next year's first. And we all know how that goes. That's in Minnesota now, right? So when I look at where the Saints could potentially get the best bang for their buck, they're better off sticking around at 29 and seeing how the board falls to them. And then maybe they see that it's an attractive option to trade back. We'll explore that here in a little bit. But if I'm the Saints, I'm avoiding trading up. And maybe the exception there, like I mentioned, if a Jaxon Smith-Njigba makes it all the way down to the 20s for some reason, right? Which doesn't feel very likely at all. You're kind of hoping on that point. You're kind of praying for something like that to happen, but you're not actually expecting to see that happen. Then maybe in that case, you make a jump up. Brad Spielberger, who we've had here on the show over at Pro Football Focus, as well as a contributor for Over the Cap specialist, but also a New Orleans Saints specialist, had the New Orleans Saints in his latest mock draft over at Pro Football Focus trading up from 29 to 25 to draft Myles Murphy, the edge rusher from Clemson. Myles Murphy is a second round grade for me, but is a guy that would be taken in the first round. That makes some sense. And it was a trade that didn't cost the Saints a lot. If I recall correctly, the details of the trade were the Saints trading away 29 and then like 145 and 167. And then they moved up 4 spots to 25 and they got 240. Okay, sure. But could you have also gotten Myles Murphy potentially at 29 in that mock? Perhaps. But Brad's doing the sort of exploring the situation and exploring the scenarios, things like that. I don't know that I make that trade. Even though it doesn't really cost the Saints a lot, I don't know that I make that one. And the reason why is because that developmental edge rusher in the first round, you can find in the third round. An Andre Carter out of Army, a KJ Henry out of Clemson, that guy's running mate in the fourth round, potentially as in early day 3. You could find that type of player. A Kobe Turner who you can move inside and out from Wake Forest, who can be found potentially in day 3 or day 2 if you like him enough. But are you willing to give up 2 picks from day 3 and your original first round pick to move up 4 spots to get that guy that may or may not pan out? Now, we have to acknowledge that in every case, every draft selection is a may or may not pan out, right? But moving up for the edge rusher that was highly productive at Clemson, but is still developmental, is that what you're really willing to spend a first round pick on right now when you could potentially land somebody at a position that could be more impactful for you right away, like your defensive interior, like wide receiver, maybe even tight end, but I have some reservations about even going tight end, but safeties that can come in. Antonio Johnson, for instance. I mean, the Saints have been loading up on their defensive back, so maybe they don't feel like that's the biggest need for them. But you still have a big need on your defensive interior. So if you're choosing to go edge rusher over defensive interior, don't end up doing that with a project guy. Go with the guy that's going to be somebody that's going to immediately come in and make a difference at the position where you need the growth, where you need the help, where you need the talent, where you need the disruption. And for the Saints, it's on the defensive interior or over on the offensive side at wide receiver. Or you could even go offensive line here and stick around at 29 and grab somebody that can plug in on the interior so that you have somebody in case Andres Pete gets hurt, in case Cesar Ruiz isn't ready to go coming off a Liz Frank injury at the beginning of the year. I wouldn't blame the Saints for going tackle if they really, really wanted to and really, really needed to, considering that you bookended Trevor Penning's rookie year with 2 different foot injuries. And then you have Ryan Ramczyk, who was limited or did not participate almost every single Wednesday of last year's practices because of lingering issues with knees and back and all these other things. So sure, grab a tackle. So there's a lot of different ways that the Saints could go standing pat at 29 that could have an immediate impact for them. So maybe trading up isn't worth the value. And maybe trading up a couple of spots isn't worth your time. So that's my one thing. Mickey, New Orleans Saints front office, maybe not necessarily trading up this year. But could you potentially trade down for the first time since 2007? Yes. And I'm going to explain to you exactly why and how you could get it done. We got all that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Yeah, they're here with us. And right now there is so many things that you can get in on over at FanDuel.com/locked-on, including if you're a first-time user, you can get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. It's bonus bets that comes back to you if your first bet doesn't win, which means that there's no losing with your first bet. I'll explain to you how to get a hold of that no-sweat first bet, but I want to tell you first, you've got the women's college basketball tournament, the men's college basketball tournament, the NBA. Pelicans have 8 games left in the season. Can they close off and get that playoff spot? Can they get into the play-in or playoffs? If you want to get in on any of that action, everything from the money line to threes drained to points scored, or you can bundle a bunch of it together in same game parlays to maximize your payout, FanDuel.com/locked-on is the place for you. Because if you head there, FanDuel.com/locked-on, you're going to get that no sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets if you're a first time user. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/locked-on to learn more. FanDuel, make every moment more. An official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. The 2023 draft provides enough talent from rounds 2 through 5, enough impact talent, that the Saints could potentially trade back for the first time since 2007, and it would make perfect sense. Appreciate you as always making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So what would it look like if the New Orleans Saints decided that they were going to trade back, and how could it potentially help them as opposed to hurt them? We kind of discussed how this year's draft class trading up probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but trading back could potentially be exactly what the New Orleans Saints need to do. So the way to kind of look at this is that every draft pick is assigned a points value, right? And the standard sort of points value is the Jimmy Johnson valuation chart. There's another valuation chart that you can look at as well. They're both hosted over at Draft Tech, TEK, if you want to go and check it out. But for the Saints, pick number 29 comes in at 640 points. So if you look at what that means in terms of how the sort of draft picks add up in later rounds and things like that, there is a potential that you could end up with 2 top 100 selections in exchange for pick 29 by not going any lower than your original 40th overall pick in the second round. So here's an example of that. The Saints' number 29 selection is valued at 640 points. The Las Vegas Raiders hold a pick 38, so only a few picks down the second round board. That is valued at 520 points. They also hold number 100 overall, which sits at 100 points exactly. So you could get 2 more top 100 selections just by trading back. You could potentially still get something else out of there too, if you really wanted to when it came to Vegas, because they'd be coming in about 20 points short. So if you look down the chart a little bit further, you might be able to get their compensatory 5th round pick, get yourself a 3rd, 5th, so that maybe you could trade up into the 4th round with some of those selections, things like that, that would kind of even all out. So if you saw the Saints trade back from 29 to 38, but also add 100 and 174, that's a pretty good deal for New Orleans, because again, that cloud of players that's going to be available at 29, a vast majority of them you could reasonably expect to still be available at 38. And that depends upon what your sort of cloud of players is. You think about some of the defensive tackles that could potentially still be there at 38. Mozzie Smith out of Michigan, Siaki Ika out of Baylor. You could potentially see a guy like Tuli Tuipulotu, who is more of an edge rusher, but can move inside as well. He's kind of a Saints, I don't want to call him a prototype, but he fits the Saints mold. And so him being somebody that could be available at 38 could be enough to say, all right, well, if it means that I get an extra top 100 selection, even if it is 100 itself, if I'm the Saints front office, then I'm down to take that. If that's not enough and you don't want to bounce out of the first round, there's an avenue for that too. It means that you have to move a later pick, but it gives you an opportunity to advance that later pick into an earlier selection. For instance, the Saints, again, pick 29, valued at 640 points. If they wanted to move back with the Kansas City Chiefs to 31, if the Chiefs are interested in moving up, right? That's not just a one-way street here. That pick 31 is valued at 600 points. So if you're looking at picking up another top 100 selection, the Kansas City Chiefs own pick number 95. In order to even out the scales for the Saints, they would have to give up 115. But the fact of the matter is that you only move back 2 spots in the first round, but then you advance your 4th round pick 20 spots to get back into the bottom of the 3rd round in the compensatory picks there. So that gives you 31, 40, 71, and 95. That's 4 top 100 selections. And we've heard the Saints year after year after year say that they got how many top 100 selections. They care about that. And so you're guaranteeing yourself, because their top 100 is different than 31 other top 100s around the NFL, you're guaranteeing yourself 4 of your top 100 prospects by getting 4 top 100 selections. Is it possible you could still end up with a 4th top 100 graded selection by staying at 115 and staying at 29? Absolutely. Absolutely possible. Because again, everyone's top 100 is different. But if you wanted to guarantee yourself that, and if you're not so concerned about getting a first round graded player in the first round, which would require a trade up more than likely, and if all of those guys are off the board at 29, and maybe one of those guys is still on the board on Kansas City's board to where they want to move up when you're on the clock at 29, I think you're warranted in sitting around at 29 and seeing who's on the board and seeing who wants to deal and potentially moving back for the first time since 2007. Does it happen very often? No. Does it mean that it's impossible? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And especially when you have a draft class like this that is so thick with many C's in between the 2nd round and the 5th round. that you have the, let's call it versatility, something the Saints care about so much. You have the versatility, the flexibility, the malleability to be able to move around and do what you want to do, achieve what you want to achieve through the first 4 selections that you make, as opposed to being stubborn about the very first selection that you make. Not that trading up is stubborn. If there's a draft prospect that you consider can't miss, just like the Saints saw Chris Olave in 2022, they did everything they had to do to go and get him. They advanced this year's first-round pick, original first-round pick, to be a first-round pick last year. Then they moved one of those picks up to make sure that they got their guy in Chris Olave and walked away with Trevor Penning, who they also loved, clearly. So if you're the Saints and you look at sort of the pool of players that could be available to you at 29, and if you have more than, let's say, 7 or 8 players that you really like at that spot, there's potential that if you move back 7 or 8 selections and picked up another top 100 pick in the meanwhile, or advanced a 115 or a 147 into something closer into the top 100 or just outside the top 100, that it's worth your time. So I know the Saints don't often trade back, but if they did this year, I wouldn't be surprised at all. This feels like, especially at the bottom of the first round, and in some cases at the top of the first round. We've already seen the Chicago Bears do it because they didn't need the quarterback. Could potentially see the Arizona Cardinals do it out of pick 3. Now, if you're the Saints, you're not going to get the same kind of haul as those guys got, right? Because those are players that are moving into trying to get quarterbacks. But what if there is a team like the Las Vegas Raiders that loves Hendon Hooker and decides, hey, New Orleans, they got their quarterback, used to be our quarterback. They got their quarterback. Let's move up. Let's see if they're interested in moving up or letting us move up to 29 so that we can get Hendon Hooker, get the 5th-year option on him, give him a year behind Jimmy Garoppolo or half a year with Jimmy Garoppolo, whatever, and then continue to develop him. And then all of a sudden, he's the Raiders starting quarterback. Hendon Hooker on a Raiders jersey seems pretty good. So you look at everything that the Saints could potentially do there. Because then if you have the Raiders who are moving up because they didn't get their quarterback early, and so they're trying to get back into the first round to get a quarterback, you get to charge a little bit of a premium for that because you know they're moving up for a quarterback in that case if they didn't get their quarterback early. So there's a lot of different routes that this can all go. And maybe the Raiders one is a little bit far-fetched. That's fine. But if you know that a team is trying to get back into that first round and you think it's going to be for a quarterback, it does make a difference. It does make a difference because then you end up charging way more than just that pick 100 that we discussed earlier. And you get pick 38 and your same cloud of players, 2 picks within 3 picks or within 3 selections. Pretty good spot to be. So trading back, not a bad option for the New Orleans Saints. Trading up, it's got to be for the right player. But trading back, you can have a little bit more education before you make that decision. Coming up next, Big Rob. Big Rob, one of our favorites here on Locked On Saints, coming through with a mock draft that goes tight end in the first round. I'm going to tell you 2 different things. I'm going to tell you why I would never take a tight end in the first round, even at the end of the first round. And I'm going to tell you why I think I should probably just shut up. I got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with our Mock Draft Monday, or concluding our Mock Draft Monday with a quick look at a listener or audience member. You know, I don't know if you're watching or if you're listening. And so, but a Locked On audience member, a Locked On Who Dat, that's coming through with a pretty good 7-round mock draft. It's a little Louisiana heavy, not going to lie, but it does come in and create a couple of really, really excellent points too. Really good conversation to be had around this. So pick number 29 in the first round. And by the way, this is coming from Big Rob, whose Twitter handle, if you want to follow, is Rob8409316. And he's coming through here, round 1, pick 29 with Michael Mayer, the big tight end out of Notre Dame. Pretty much tight end 1 on most boards. Some folks have Luke Musgrave up there. There are some folks that are really, really into Sam Laporta out of Iowa. Luke Musgrave coming out of Oregon State. All of these tight ends is a fantastic tight end class. Everyone all the way down to like the Old Dominion kids. Zach Kuntz is up there. There's so many different players that are just remarkably athletic, have a ton of talent. Davis Allen out of Clemson, who's going to be probably a day 3 guy with a 91.9% contested catch rate, all of that. I'll circle back to actually, no reason to make you wait. So the tight end situation for me is that when I'm making a first round pick, I want an immediate impact player. And I think a lot of people will look at how exciting this tight end class is and say, well, Ross, some of these players could be immediate impact. Sure, they could. But the likelihood of them being is very slim, right? Because tight end has one of the biggest learning curves, if not the biggest learning curve, coming from college to the NFL. You learn an entirely new way to play the position once you come to the NFL. And so because of that, drafting a tight end in the first round kind of negates you from getting that round one immediate impact first year rookie that's going to come in and have that make a big difference for your offense in this case. Now, is that always going to be the case? No. Every 20 years you get a Travis Kelce. But are you willing to be the team that is trying to make the thing that very rarely happens happen in the first round? Kind of like drafting 5'10" quarterbacks. I know there's a lot of people who get super excited about Stetson Bennett at the end of the draft. Or, guys like Lindsey Scott out of Incarnate Wood, former LSU Tiger. These guys are small. And do you want to be the person that rolls the dice and says, yeah, it's going to work when you're talking about a first round prospect when it never works or when it very rarely works? I don't think you do. Now, here's why I should shut up. This tight end class is different, just different. It might be one of the best positions as a collective that we've seen in any NFL draft in recent memory. That's how good this tight end class is. It's spectacular. So if there's any tight end class that's going to prove the idea that first round tight ends are a bad idea wrong, it's probably going to be this one. But again, as an NFL franchise, are you willing to burn a first round pick on a guy that wouldn't even be in your starting lineup as your top tight end in this year's class and in this year's roster, on this year's roster? Are you willing to burn that to try to be the first team that makes the thing that rarely happens happen since Travis Kelce? I don't know. I personally would not be, especially at picks 40 and 71, or you advance some of your picks, things like that, get into sort of that 55 to 65 range with which our friend David Harrison did a really great exercise over in Locked On Commanders about the perfect sort of spot for tight ends. And that's kind of that run between 40, I would say probably 40 to 60, where you could still walk away with the Sam Laporta at the end of it all. I'll roll the dice in the second round. I'm not willing to roll the dice in the first round. Now, if you trade back and you come out of the first round and you've got that pick 38, then you use that pick 38 to grab yourself whatever player is in your first round cloud. And then at pick 40, you take the best tight end off the board. Darnell Washington out of Georgia, Sam Laporta out of Iowa, Luke Musgrave out of Oregon State, or maybe Michael Mayer falls. Unlikely, but maybe he falls out of the first round. Sure, 100%. But my first selection has to be somebody that I feel really, really good is going to come in and have an immediate impact as a rookie. That's why I'm so stuck on defensive interior. And the exception in terms of not having an immediate impact in year one, but having a big time impact in year two, interior offensive line, wide receiver. So those are the spots that I go. But again, if there's anything that's going to make me shut up here, it's how just remarkable this tight end class is. Okay. Let's get to the rest of this mock draft because there's some interesting stuff here. Pick 40 in the second round, Calijah Kancey, defensive tackle out of Pittsburgh, falling, right? 71, Siaki Ika, defensive tackle out of Baylor. I love that pairing. That pairing has an argument by the time you get to the last quarter of the 2023 NFL season. That pairing of Calijah Kancey and Siaki Ika could potentially be getting more snaps than Colin Saunders and Nathan Shepard. That's how good those players are. It's going to be completely contingent on whether or not Calijah Kancey's size will translate to the NFL with his skill level. But there's an argument to be made that those guys could potentially develop so quickly because of their specializations and what they do, that they would have such clearly defined roles that they could potentially outsnap a couple of veterans. But even if they didn't, you're still very happy with Nathan Shepard and Colin Saunders. No doubt about it. Jonathan Mingo, wide receiver out of Ole Miss at 115. That's an interesting pick, and I think a good one. You get speed. You get somebody that can go up there and get it as well. Some pretty good size. Keeps you away from these sort of undersized guys that you need to kind of operate at another level. All of that. Tyjae Spears at 146. What a fall, especially a guy who ends up running a 4.47 according to many NFL scouts at his pro day. We'll see him again at the local pro day here in New Orleans on April 7th. Yes, April 7th. And so we'll get another look at him. Maybe he impacts his draft stock a little bit there. But, I mean, it's a match made in heaven as far as I'm concerned. Now we're starting to get to the Louisiana heaviness here. So we got Tyjae Spears at 146. At 165, the second first-round pick, Jay Ward, the safety out of LSU. You get a little bit of versatility. You get a little bit of big hitter guy. I might invest in a different position here in the 5th round, considering all of the safeties and all the defensive backs that the Saints have already added in free agency. It's got to be maximum value. I don't think this is maximum value at that position and with this particular player at this point in the draft. This is where I'm kind of looking at, maybe do I go with an edge rusher, a later edge rusher that you can try to develop? Do I go with a linebacker to try to bolster the depth? And Big Rob here is not too far behind on that one at all. Pick 227, first pick in the 7th round. He goes with Vanderbilt linebacker Anthony Orji, who just does whatever. I mean, hyper athletic, does all the things, like really, really good. And then the pick 225 here, Michael Jefferson, the wide receiver out of Louisiana Lafayette. I know they hate being called Louisiana Lafayette, but for people outside the state of Louisiana that aren't aware, Louisiana Lafayette. Big guy that wants to get a little bit better with his contested catches, has a lot of speed, averaged, I can't remember how many yards it was per catch 2 years ago, but just tons of yards per catch a couple of years ago. Really talented young player, NFL size, all of that. Just needs to get a little bit better in terms of contested catches. That's actually what the Saints told him when they met with him at the combine. Everything. So there you go. Pretty good draft. I mean, like I would solidly give this like a B, like a solid B. Like I would not be upset with this draft. You're just kind of waiting to see how quickly can Michael Mayer translate to the NFL. And before we wrap up here, some breaking news coming from Lamar Jackson himself in a letter to fans where he illustrates and lays out that he has requested a trade from the Baltimore Ravens on March 2nd. So we will see where Lamar Jackson ends up. Remember, a whole bunch of teams were not interested in delivering the offer sheet, but now that he has requested a trade, let's see how far this all goes. I still think that the Saints made the right decision by going after Derek Carr, not waiting around this long to answer their quarterback question, but could it be a decision that they end up regretting in the next couple of years? We'll have to wait and see. I still think they're on the right side of this with the Derek Carr signing, but we'll see how this all plays out. And obviously, we'll be keeping you up to date with that because depending upon where he lands, it could end up having a lasting impact on New Orleans, especially if he ends up in the NFC South division. I appreciate y'all, as always, for coming through and being here for another episode of Locked On Saints, making us your first listen of the day, every day. Tomorrow, we're going to dive into Bryan Edwards, a wide receiver that our good friend Nick Underhill over at NewOrleans.football points out is a player that the Saints have at least expressed some interest in or kind of looking into to see where they can find that physical wide receiver that they want. And there's a lot of panic around this, and it was met with a lot of animosity. So I'm going to explain to you why this would be a good move and why it's very, very low risk. So we got that coming up for you in tomorrow's episode, as well as potentially keeping you up to date with everything going on with Lamar Jackson. Appreciate you as always again for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL Scouting. Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino, giving you everything you need to know about what it takes to build a successful NFL franchise. If you want to check them out, make sure you subscribe and follow for free wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Thanks as always, y'all, for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. Big shout out to my boy, Damien. Thank you so much for saying hi on, it was brunch on Saturday, Friday, something like that. Well, Friday. Yeah. It was good to meet you, homie. Appreciate you so much for saying hi. As always, if you need anything in between these episodes on your New Orleans Saints, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.